In the chronicles of maritime history, specifically regarding the eastern coast of Cambodia, in the year 1885, there lies the mention of an event so extraordinary, so shrouded in mystery, that official government records gloss over it for lack of explanation. It began around 1880. A reign of terror descended upon those waters. A vicious syndicate of pirates, known locally as the Sea Vultures, began to plague the trade routes. The Cambodian Naval Police and the colonial marines tried everything to suppress them, but they failed miserably. They couldn't even find them. It was as if these pirates were ghosts. Their small, swift vessels would swoop down out of nowhere, strip the massive merchant ships of their wealth, and vanish before the heavy warships could even rotate their cannons. They slipped through the tightest blockades, mocking the authorities, until a rumor began to spread among the uneducated sailors and dock workers. These were not men. They were demons. Commerce on the eastern coast ground to a halt. Sailors, tough men willing to die fighting other men, refused to sail. They would fight flesh and blood, they said, but they could not fight the supernatural. The authorities were desperate. They launched massive campaigns, but the result was zero. The legend of the phantom pirates only grew darker. 50 years later, you can still hear the whispers of that legend in the port towns. The story usually ends with the event of 1885. A massive armed steamer, the first of its kind in those waters, carrying a fortune in spices and weaponry near Saigon, was hijacked. It was a scandal that shook the merchant world. But the strangest part? That was the last attack. After looting that steamer, the Sea Vultures simply ceased to exist. The scourge that had made the ocean tremble vanished as if by black magic. Why did they disappear? How could an entire fleet of cutthroats evaporate into thin air? The government files have no answer. I never thought I would find the solution to a half-century-old maritime mystery while sitting in a quiet living room in Boston, Massachusetts. But life has a strange way of burying the truth in the most ordinary places. It happened during a family reunion. We were celebrating the return of my great-uncle, Dr. Silas Fawn. Silas was a legend in our family, the black sheep who had left America decades ago to practice tropical medicine in the wildest corners of Sumatra. He had finally come home to retire. I was just a teenager then, fascinated by the idea of this man. I expected a frail old retiree, but Silas was astounding. He was 70, yet he stood with the posture of a soldier. He was 6 feet 2, broad-shouldered, with a face that was weathered but not worn. He had a magnetic personality, cracking jokes with the kids and charming the adults. But there was something in his eyes, a shadow that hinted at a life lived on the edge of a knife. We were all seated at the long dining table. Silas was in the middle of a hilarious anecdote about local customs in Sumatra. The mood was light, filled with laughter. Then the main course was brought out. It was a New England seafood boil, featuring large, whole red crabs. As the platter was placed in front of him, Silas froze. The color drained from his face so fast It looked like he'd been shot. He stared at the red shell of the crab, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. He pushed his chair back with a screech that silenced the room. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Take it away. I can't." I was sitting next to him, confused. "Uncle Silas? It's just crab. I thought you loved seafood. Are your teeth bothering you?" Silas forced a smile, but it looked like a grimace of pain. "My teeth are fine, Sam. But, my God, looking at that creature makes my skin crawl." He stood up abruptly. "I'm sorry. I've lost my appetite. An old man needs his rest. Please, excuse me." He walked out of the room so fast, it felt like he was fleeing a crime scene. The table was left in stunned silence. My father rushed after him, but Silas waved him off, claiming he was just tired. But we all knew it wasn't fatigue. It was fear. Later that afternoon, I found him sitting on the porch, staring blankly at the garden. I was the only one brave enough, or curious enough, to ask. "Why didn't you eat, Uncle?" I pressed. "You have to tell me." Silas looked at me for a long time. Finally, he let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Sam, if I tell you the truth, you'll think senility has finally claimed my brain. I've never told a soul. People don't believe in the impossible." He lit his pipe, the smoke curling around his grim expression. "You might think I'm crazy, but 50 years ago, I saw things that would make a sane man question reality. It's why I can't look at a crab without feeling like I'm going to pass out." And so, he began his story. "It was 1885, Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. I had been working in Sumatra for a few years. A terrible smallpox epidemic was brewing, and we were out of vaccines. I received word that a French doctor in Saigon had developed a new batch of cultures in his laboratory. I volunteered to go get them. The trip to Saigon was uneventful, but the return trip? That was the problem. The panic about the pirates, the sea vultures, had reached a fever pitch. The local crews in Saigon were terrified. They refused to sail through the devil's waters off the Cambodian coast. I was stranded, holding a crate of life-saving vaccines with no way to get back to my dying patients. Just as I was losing hope, a French official told me about a new vessel. A company had just commissioned a massive steel-hulled steamer, the Iron Sovereign. It was heavily armed, carrying 50 colonial marines and 2 deck cannons. It was leaving for Java the next day. I felt like I'd won the lottery. This ship was a fortress. Surely, no pirate in a wooden junk would dare approach it. I boarded with my precious cargo, vials of the smallpox virus essentially, tucked safely in my vest pocket and my luggage. The ship was magnificent. As we left the harbor, I felt invincible. I almost wished the pirates would show up, just so we could blow them out of the water. Be careful what you wish for, Sam. The first day passed, then the second. On the third evening, we were in the middle of the ocean. The sun had set, and the moon was obscured by heavy clouds. The sea was pitch black. Suddenly, the steady rhythm of the steamer's paddle wheels was drowned out by the ship's whistle screaming a warning. The engines cut out. Silence fell. I ran to the deck. The captain was shouting orders. The Marines were rushing to their stations, rifles cocked. Far out in the darkness, we saw them. Faint, bobbing lights. The pirate fleet. We opened fire immediately. The cannons roared, shaking the deck plates. The rifles cracked in the night. It seemed like we had the upper hand. The pirate lights winked out one by one as they scattered. The captain, a bold man, grew overconfident. "Don't let them escape," he roared. "Run them down! Fire into the dark!" We didn't have searchlights back then. That was our fatal mistake. We chased the shadows, the steamer picking up speed, hunting the smaller boats. We were winning, or so we thought. Suddenly, the world turned upside down. There was a deafening screech of metal on rock. The impact threw everyone to the deck. The Iron Sovereign shuddered violently and groaned like a dying beast. We had been lured straight into a submerged reef. The captain screamed to reverse engines, but it was too late. The hull was breached. Water was pouring in. And that's when the trap sprung. The lights we had been chasing were just the bait. The main pirate fleet had been behind us the whole time, running dark. Now, with our ship impaled on the rocks, they swarmed us. It was chaos. The darkness was filled with the screams of drowning passengers and the war cries of the boarders. They didn't just want the cargo. They were slaughtering everyone. I saw men and women cut down where they stood. I realized there was no escape. I prepared to jump into the black water, preferring to drown rather than face their blades. But before I could leap, something hard struck the back of my skull. The world exploded into white light and then faded into absolute darkness. When I woke up, the sun was beating down on my face. My hands and feet were bound. I was lying on the filthy deck of a pirate junk. The steamer was gone, sunk. I realized with a sinking heart that I hadn't been killed. I had been taken as a slave. I struggled to sit up and saw where we were heading. Ahead of us rose a massive, sheer cliff face rising straight out of the ocean. I knew this landmark. Ships always steered clear of it because there was no anchorage, just vertical rock walls. Yet, the pirate ships were sailing straight for it. I thought they were going to crash us into the wall to kill us all. But as we got closer, a secret revealed itself. Hidden at the base of the cliff, obscured by overlapping rocks, was a narrow fissure, a natural tunnel. The ship slipped into the darkness of the tunnel. We drifted for 10 agonizing minutes in pitch blackness. Then suddenly, we burst out into the sunlight. I gasped. We were inside a hidden lagoon, a hollowed-out volcanic crater completely invisible from the sea. The water was calm and blue, and lined along the internal shores were huts, storehouses, and ships. This was their nest. This was where the sea vultures lived, hoarding their loot, safe from the world. They dragged me off the boat and threw me onto the sand alongside a dozen other miserable captives. I looked around at this paradise that was about to become my hell. But I had no idea that the true horror wasn't the pirates. The true horror was waiting in the water, and it was small, red, and hungry. The life that followed inside that crater was the descent into a living hell, Silas continued, his voice tightening as the memories flooded back. I had seen cruelty before in the colonies, but the sea vultures were something else entirely. They weren't just thieves, they were sadists. They stripped us of our names and dignity. We were livestock to them. We worked until our muscles failed, building their huts, scrubbing their decks, and carrying their loot. And the food? God, the food. They would feast on roasted pig and fine rice right in front of us, laughing as they kicked the scraps into the dirt. We were forced to fight over moldy bread and fish heads. If you were too slow, you starved. If you complained, you died. I saw a man gutted for looking a guard in the eye. I wore the remnants of my suit until it was nothing but rags hanging off my bones. But one day, about a month into my captivity, I found something that stopped my heart. I was trying to tie a knot in my tattered vest when my fingers brushed against a small hard lump in the lining. I froze. I carefully worked it out. It was a glass ampule, miraculously unbroken. It was one of the smallpox culture samples from the French lab. I stared at that little glass vial, shaking. In my hand, I held the power of a god. I realized with a cold clarity that I could end this. I could wait until I was serving their mess hall, break the vial into their wine or stew, and unleash a plague that would wipe every single one of these monsters off the face of the earth. It would be justice, pure, biblical justice. But then I looked at the other slaves, hollow-cheeked men from India, China, and Malaya. If I unleashed the pox, they would die too. I was a doctor, sworn to save life, not to become an angel of death. With a heavy heart, I tucked the vial back into a hidden fold of my rags. I couldn't do it. Fate, however, has a wicked sense of humor. I wouldn't release a plague. Nature would do it for me. My job was to fish in the lagoon. They gave us a small leaky skiff and a few nets. One morning, about 2 months in, we rowed out as usual. The sun was just hitting the water. I cast the net, and after a while, I went to haul it in. It was incredibly heavy. "We've hit a school of tuna," my rowing partner whispered, his eyes gleaming with the hope of stealing a raw bite. We pulled and pulled, straining against the weight. Finally, the net broke the surface. But there were no silver scales. The net was a writhing, clicking mass of red. It was crabs, thousands of them. But they were tiny, no bigger than spiders. The entire net was coated in them. Disappointed, we shook the net to clear them. But they didn't fall. They clung on. And then they started climbing. They swarmed up the ropes, pouring over the gunwales of our boat like a red liquid. They scuttled over our bare feet, their tiny pincers pinching at our skin. It was repulsive. We spent an hour sweeping them off with our hands, crushing hundreds of them just to clear the boat. We caught no fish that day. The water was choked with them. When we returned to shore, empty-handed, the pirate overseer was furious. "Where is the catch?" he barked. "The water's played, sir," I tried to explain. "It's full of red crabs. They ate the bait. They clogged the nets." He didn't believe me. He accused us of laziness and raised his whip. But before he could strike, he looked down. The sand at the water's edge was moving. A carpet of red was slowly crawling out of the lagoon. The baby crabs were coming ashore. He stomped on a few, laughing. "Useless vermin," he sneered. That was the beginning. By the next morning, the laughter stopped. When we woke up, the lagoon looked like a pool of blood. The water was solid red. The crabs had grown. Overnight, they had doubled in size. They were now the size of walnuts, and they were everywhere. They covered the beaches, the rocks, the docks. The pirates ordered us to clear them. We used shovels, brooms, sticks. We smashed them by the thousands, the stench of crushed shell and briny meat filling the air. But for every one we killed, 10 more washed ashore. It was a biological explosion, a population boom so unnatural it defied science. By the third day, the crabs were the size of apples, and they were hungry. They ate everything. They stripped the bushes of leaves. They ate the leather straps of the pirates' sandals. They found the food stores. The pirates had a warehouse full of rice and dried meat. By noon, a red army had breached the walls. The pirates tried to fight them back with swords and torches, but it was like fighting the tide. The crabs swarmed over the sacks, devouring the grain, the wood, the very sacks themselves. That night, true terror set in. There was nowhere to sleep. The ground was alive. If you stood still for more than 10 seconds, they would start climbing your legs. Their pincers were now strong enough to break skin. We slaves huddled together, dancing a frantic jig, stomping and brushing, never resting. The pirates retreated to their stilted huts, thinking they were safe. They weren't. The crabs climbed the wooden pilings. I will never forget the screams that night. One of the pirate captains, a brute of a man who had drunk himself into a stupor to ignore the noise, had passed out on the floor of his hut. He didn't wake up when they swarmed him. When the sun rose, we found him, or what was left of him. It was a skeleton, picked perfectly clean, still wearing a pirate's hat. The red carpet had stripped him of every ounce of flesh in hours. Panic broke out. The pirates, these fearless killers who laughed at the Navy, were screaming like children. They fired their muskets into the mass, but what does a bullet do to 1,000,000 crabs? They tried to launch their ships to escape, but the crabs had eaten the caulking between the planks. As soon as the boats hit the water, they sank, swarming with red bodies. We were trapped. The lagoon was a bowl of death. My feet were bleeding from 100 tiny nips. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and nearing madness. The crabs were now as big as my fist. Their shells were hard, their claws serrated. They were evolving right in front of our eyes, becoming perfect killing machines. The lower ground was lost. The only hope was the cliffs, the steep rock walls of the crater. The crabs struggled to climb the vertical stone. As the sun began to set on the fourth day, marking the beginning of another night of horror, I made a decision. I looked at the sheer cliff face. It was suicide to climb it, but it was death to stay. I started to run toward the rocks, stomping over a crunching carpet of living red horrors. I had to get high ground. I had to find a cave, a ledge, anything. But as I reached the base of the cliff, I realized my mistake. The crabs were thinking the same thing. They were piling up against the rock wall, climbing over each other, forming a living ramp of bodies to reach the higher ledges. I was halfway up a narrow goat path when I felt a sharp, bone-crushing pain in my ankle. I looked down. A crab, now the size of a dinner plate, had clamped onto my leg. Its eyes were black and bead-like, staring right at me. I smashed it with a rock, but the claw stayed locked in my flesh. I tore it loose, screaming in pain, blood gushing from the wound. I scrambled into a small, shallow cave about 50 feet up the cliff face. I collapsed, gasping for air. I looked out over the lagoon. It was gone. The water, the beach, the village. It was all just a shifting, clicking ocean of red. And the tide was rising. They were coming up the cliff. I was trapped in a cave, bleeding, with no weapon, no food, and an army of millions coming to eat me alive. And that is when I remembered the vial in my pocket. And I realized the terrible irony of what had happened. Standing alone in that shallow cave, I knew I had minutes, maybe seconds, before the end, Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper, his eyes fixed on the darkening garden. Outside, the sound was deafening, the clicking of millions of legs against stone. They were coming. I knew that without fire, I was dead meat. There was some dry scrub and old bird nests in the back of the cave. Nature's small mercy. I began to frantically pile them up near the entrance. My plan was simple. Build a wall of fire. Crabs fear heat. If I could keep the fire going, I might survive the night. After that, I didn't have a plan. I gathered the grass and reached into my pocket for my matches. In my haste, I stumbled on the uneven floor. I fell hard onto the pile of brush. At that exact moment, I felt a sharp, searing pain in my side, right near my waist. A massive crab, perhaps one that had been hiding in the shadows of the cave, had clamped its claw onto me. It crushed through my vest, sinking its serrated pincers deep into my flesh. I screamed, thrashing wildly. But as I struck the beast with a rock to dislodge it, I heard another sound. A sound far more terrifying than the clicking of claws. I heard the distinct, sickening crunch of glass. I ripped the crab loose, throwing its crushed body against the wall. I clutched my side, my hand coming away wet. Blood? Yes, but not just blood. I reached into my pocket and felt the wet shards, the vial, the smallpox culture. It was shattered. The glass had cut me, and the fluid, the concentrated live virus intended to start an epidemic, was now mixing directly into my open wound. I froze. I was a doctor. I knew exactly what I had just done. I had injected myself with death. But I had no time to process the horror. The red tide was spilling over the lip of the cave entrance. With shaking hands, I struck a match. The dry grass caught instantly. A wall of flame roared to life. The lead crabs, singed by the heat, scuttled back, creating a temporary barrier. I collapsed in the corner of the cave, safely behind the fire, but I was already doomed. The heat outside was nothing compared to the fire starting in my veins. The fever hit me with the force of a freight train. I realized the grim irony. I had refused to use the virus on the pirates, but fate had decided to use it on me. The next few days are a blur of delirium. I don't know how long I lay there. I remember lucid moments where I fed the fire with the last of the scrub. I remember hallucinations. Demons with red shells. Pirates with skeletal faces. I waited to be eaten. I waited to die. But nothing came. Then, one morning, I woke up. The fever had broken. I was weak, wasted away to skin and bone, but my mind was clear. I was alive. I sat up, expecting to see the pincers, but there was only silence. An eerie, heavy silence. I crawled to the mouth of the cave. The fire had long since burned out. I looked down into the lagoon, and my breath caught in my throat. The world below was dead. The entire crater, the beach, the water, the pirate village, was a crimson graveyard. There was no movement, no clicking, just millions upon millions of empty red shells. The air was thick with the stench of decay. I climbed down, stepping on the brittle remains of the army that had tried to consume me. I walked through the pirate village. It was a ghost town. The crabs had finished their work on the men before the end came for them. I saw the clean white bones of the pirates scattered among the red shells. But why did the crabs die? It hit me then. The broken vial. Smallpox is a vicious, highly contagious virus. When that crab bit me, and I crushed it, our blood mixed. The virus jumped. Modern science is still learning about cross-species transmission. But I saw it happen. I had become patient zero for the crustaceans. The infection had spread through their densely packed swarm like wildfire. I had inadvertently launched biological warfare in that lagoon. The pirates died by the claws of the crabs, and the crabs died by the poison in my blood. I didn't stay to investigate further. I survived for 4 days on rainwater collected in rock pools and grass seeds. Eventually, I lashed together some driftwood and salvage from the beach to make a raft. I pushed out of that cursed lagoon, floating into the open sea. 2 days later, a British merchant ship spotted me. I told them I was a shipwreck survivor. I never mentioned the lagoon. I never mentioned the pirates. And I certainly never mentioned the Red Plague. If I had told them the truth, they would have locked me in an asylum. Silas placed his pipe on the table. The story was over. The porch was silent, save for the distant chirping of crickets. "So," I whispered, breaking the spell. "The crabs, they really died from the virus?" Silas looked at me with a weary, melancholy smile. "I can't be certain, Sam. I'm a man of science. But out there, the lines blur. Maybe it was the virus. Maybe it was God cleaning the slate. All I know is that I survived when everything else died." He stood up, his joints creaking. "Come on inside. It's getting cold. And Sam, now you know why I made a scene at dinner. If you ever want to see your uncle again, never ever put a red crab on my plate." He walked back into the warmth of the house, leaving me alone in the dark. I looked out toward the ocean, listening to the waves. For a brief moment, I imagined I could hear it. A faint, rhythmic clicking, rising from the deep, reminding me that some mysteries are better left buried in the dark.